Folks, thanks for your questions there. We've now come to our penultimate speaker, and he's our keynote speaker. It's Dr. Iain Percy, OBE. He's a 4-time Olympian, 3-time Olympic medalist, and double Olympic champion. He's a veteran of 4 America's Cup challenges, beginning in 2005 as the helmsman for the Plus 39 Challenge. Before joining Great Britain's America Cup Challenge, Team Origin, and after retiring from Olympic competition in 2012, he joined Artemis Racing as a tactician. Before being appointed the team manager in October 2013, Iain then went on to lead the team's successful 35th America's Cup campaign in Bermuda. He is passionate about protecting the oceans. He's an economics graduate and founded Artemis Technology in 2017 with a mission to see how America's Cup technology could play a part in the decarbonisation of the maritime industry. He has overseen the company's transition from a sailing services provider to an applied technologies company focused on green innovations for maritime transportation. And this includes the transformative Artemis e-foiler propulsion system. We're keen that Iain speaks today, and we're keen that Iain's part of a wider network that includes Belfast Met and Artemis are based in Belfast Harbour Industrial Estate, looking to provide the e-mobility in the marine system and that green e-mobility. So without further ado, Dr. Iain Percy, OBE, Artemis Technologies.
Thank you, Paul. I think this is one of my first webinars, so very strange talking to 250 people you can't actually see. But thank you very much for having me today. As you can see from the picture here, my background of the last 20 years, it was about 20 years ago today, that shot in Sydney at the Olympics, was in sport. And but fortunately and enjoyably for me, the sport of sailing is very technical, and it's particularly in the America's Cup. And over the last 10 years, we experienced a real revolution in the technology of water-based sport in the America's Cup. And one of the predominant changes there was in the adoption of hydrofoiling. It's not a new thing. It's been around for almost 100 years, but due to new materials and some other technological changes, it's been taken to a new level with these America's Cup challenges that, hundreds of millions of budgets. And it got to a point where these boats could go at 4 times the speed of the wind. So it was about that in 2017 when we had a successful campaign in the last America's Cup with the Swedish team Artemis, that myself and the owner of that team realized that we had a real opportunity to use that technology. We had 4 humans, I was one of them, rotating handles, producing very depressingly about 600 kilowatts between us. And sorry, that was talking it up. 600 watts. 600 kilowatts would have been good. 600 watts between us, and we were able to go 40 knots on a 4-ton vessel. So, of course, there was a lot of wind power, but it was also to do with the drag reductions. So we founded the company to use that technology to understand. We really had a lot of expertise in predominantly simulation. One of the things with modern technical sport, Formula One or America's Cup, is the real challenge is knowing the performance of your idea, your development, your innovation before you make it. You don't have many shots at things because you don't have many bullets to fire in terms of time and budget. And so the real skill is in the simulation and the performance prediction. And that really is the basis of everything we do. And the power of that was it allowed us to understand where our technology can make the biggest difference. And I was passionate about having an impact with the technology we had developed. But what I really also understood is that for that technology to make a difference, it needed to be adopted. It had to have scale. There's no point. An America's Cup boat, however incredibly impressive it is, a Formula One car, however incredibly impressive they are technically, isn't doing anything for climate change. It's tiny amounts of impact through one boat sailing. So it was really important not just to make impressive technology, but to use our simulation tools to make something that was commercially viable. And so probably 60% of the last 3 years for us has been understanding the business case, the payback times, the costs, a lot of the work that you guys are familiar with understanding the sensitivities to oil prices going forward, to electricity prices, and trying to make pragmatic decisions about arriving at a product that had a quick payback for customers. And it was really through that process that we dropped wind at source, i.e. Wind propulsion on the vessels themselves. And slightly depressingly for me as a sailor, I have to say, because I'm passionate about returning as I call returning to commercial sailing, and I believe that will be possible at some point. But today, the payback times are too long, and I say that as someone who's done a lot of technical studies for other teams through our consultancy business on wind ships, Flettner devices or wing sails on ships, and we do the technical study for them, and we also on our own do the financial study to understand the problem, and we've never seen quick payback times, unfortunately. On the other hand, on our hydrofoiling coupled with electric technology, where we couple with a Formula One supplier who have been developing motor generator units with ultra high power density, and I'll come to why that's important for us. Not everything is in terms of being high tech. Cost is always a driver, but in one aspect, that power density is very important. And produced our e-foiler system, which I'll come to, which can reduce the fuel cost for a certain type of vessel, which I'll come to again, by up to 90%, up to 2-3 million for a boat like we see on the screen here. So with that's offering payback times here between 1 and 3 years, suddenly a commercially viable project, something that's scale, and maybe more interestingly, something that's now cheaper, including infrastructure costs and road and rail to decongest. We put together a consortium based in Belfast. Why Belfast? Well, predominantly, ironically, given the huge maritime history we have there, the big attraction for us was aerospace. And when you see the boats in the next video that I'm going to play, you'll understand why. Our boats are really like planes. I'll just play that. Slides. So as you can see, a very exciting project that was launched about a week ago now by the consortium of businesses, academic institutions, training institutions, and the UK government to invest in this new technology. Our e-foiler system, though, like any zero emissions vessel, has the same trade-offs and problematics of any electrification project, and really where I see hydrogen having its play. Although unusually, a hydrofoiling vessel is the only craft or transportation craft in the world that reduces its drag as speed goes up. It's a little bit like a hill. The drag goes up, the boat takes off, the drag reduces dramatically, and then starts to rebound again. There's not many vehicles like that in the world, and but even with our technology, which is dropping the cost by 90% and the drag by up to 60-70%, we still have a range issue. It's reducing the problem. The current fast electric boats on the market are able to do. It's a good question. I'll come to that coming in. Able to do about 10 miles, and this is able to do about 100 miles on electric range. To illustrate it. Well, I just come to the next slide because it's to a really good point from Tony Lewis, who's just come in about the Boeing hydrofoil, and it's true. The only fully submerged with this type of technology hydrofoil vessel that's been in operation is the Boeing hydrofoil vessel that was made in the 80s, and they're operating still today from in Asia a lot and in wavy conditions actually. But the why did those boats not take off and these ones do? And it's and that's really quite a interesting thing about our technological changes. And it's about three things really. The first is the power density increase of electric engines, which allows us to house that within the foil, making this foil independent of the vessel, in the sense that out of the foil comes a wire and connects to battery pack that can connect onto secondary fuel sources like the hydrogen that we're discussing today. That's the only part where the real ultra high power density is important, and that's an interesting, as I touch on with the hydrogen later, because weight is a big deal, perfect for the power density of hydrogen, but volumetrically is a bit less of a deal important in maritime. But the second thing that's particularly changed since the Boeing boat of the 80s is the carbon fiber. And one of the reasons we are in Belfast is the technology developed in terms of mass producing carbon fiber wings at cost by Bombardier and Airbus there, with the wings made in the harbour. The drag sensitivity to foil thickness is absolutely incredibly steep, and until able to make carbon fiber cost effectively, the hydrofoils just weren't half as efficient. The other important point about the electric engine power density is, before that point you needed to have an engine in the vessel, but therefore you needed a shaft, and that shaft needed to have a much thicker foil that didn't bend, and that was a huge increase in drag. So the drag savings of the boats in the 80s, because of the materials, were a lot less. But the third and possibly the most important aspect to why it's different today than in the 80s is touched on by Tony's point about the waves, was about the ability to use dynamic modeling and simulation to control multiple vessels in waves. If we the work that we've done over 10 years, which is very akin to how Formula One work or aerospace, is building up computational models to model the waves, the flow within a wave, the flex of the foil under the water, the flex of the flaps, the actuation speeds, to build up digital twins that allow you to handle a variety of conditions, and very importantly with a variety of different boats. A boat that took Boeing about 7 years to make, in terms of the control laws, can be done in a matter of weeks now with the modern computational speeds and the modeling and the way in which your simulation models are captured over the years and built on. So really the difference now, and why now is the right time, is three things. One, materials has ever changed. Two, development of power density of electric engines. And three, the America's Cup driving, in our case, the very sophisticated dynamic modeling of hydrofoils in wavy conditions. And that's really what's changed today, and that's the it's that is being invested in by the consortia and by government. This is a case study of a 250 kilowatt system, just to bring home the advantages here. Really interesting to see how the drag protection on the small scale is still very, very big at low speeds. It's because a small boat of this size is very inefficient before it starts to plane as well, because it does a wheelie, for anyone who knows a boat of that size. And with the foils, you're able to level the boat out. And so that, coupled with the engine efficiency gains, makes a lot of advantages. And that's measured data. And crucially, I think, to this and why it's different to the Boeing boat, the consortium aren't making vessels, or aren't only making vessels. They're making foiling propulsion units for any boat. And that's a coupling of, as I said, some of the technological increases that allow it to be modular, and the software that allows us to control existing vessels and tune the control systems for any condition in a reasonable amount of time and cost. And that's one of the most transformative differences about this compared to, say, the metal power-hungry guzzlers of the 80s. What's interesting, though, is like all these technologies, there is upfront cost, and it's really important that to have a lot of usage to pay back for that upfront cost. So the applications are not going to be for leisure. This is not a leisure activity, and a bit like with hydrogen, concentrating on public transport. If you do a lot of miles, you can start to make it efficient. If you're just doing it as a recreational activity, it doesn't work. So the biggest market of all is the fast ferries, where you are putting 200, 230 miles a day, and that means the payback comes down into months, not years. I touched on this earlier, but even with the huge drag reductions that are created, we're still only able to do about 80 miles with a reasonable battery pack before we start snowballing, as it's known, on the battery weight, and then for the total weight, and therefore the total efficiency. So, and why I believe hydrogen has such a part to play in our project and in maritime in general is because it is a very weight sensitive issue. Just like aircraft is quite weight sensitive, but because the speeds are a little bit slower, well, a lot slower than aircraft, it isn't as volume sensitive. So where an aircraft, windage is clearly a big driver for them, and volume therefore an issue. For us, traveling at 35 knots rather than 500 knots, it's the hydrodynamic drag is huge, hence the need for very small power density engines that can be housed without the shaft. And mass is very important, because that is effectively directly driving the hydrodynamic drag through the CL or size of the foils that are underwater. But volume is not such a big deal. So suiting hydrogen in that respect, weight sensitive, not volume sensitive. And most importantly, back the other way for us, having such an efficient system, something that is now more efficient per passenger mile than road and rail, is therefore going to see bigger savings from if the fuel cost is actually higher. So ironically, if we as a community were forced to use hydrogen Europe-wide, technology like us, where the cost per passenger mile in terms of kilowatts used would suddenly become more attractive, not less. There are concepts out there already as well. It's worth noting. There's ideas and renders. We've worked on and consulted on a few of these, and a lot of interest, particularly from Scandinavia. And I think most importantly, we see this as something that is now different to traditional maritime. Traditional maritime commuter people transportation was about 9 times more expensive in some of the studies in San Francisco than sitting in your car over the bridge. But with these it's very off-putting, all these questions flying in, by the way. with these, with our technology, it's now comparable with road and slightly more expensive than rail, excluding infrastructure costs. And of course, as something we're all aware of, in the right place, in a water-based city, that infrastructure, that roadway is sitting there waiting to be used. So I thank you for your time today. The last question was, are we considering hydrogen fuel cell power systems? And the answer is not as part of this initial project, but as I touched on before, we're well aware of the advantages and the applicable nature, but we're not experts in that. And part of the reasons I'm keen to be talking and part of this community is I want to collaborate with experts in the field. Sorry, Paul, you jumped in and then I...
No, you're okay, Iain, 100%. Keep your camera live there, Iain, for a second, if you can, please.
Yeah, I think I might be having a little bit of a connection bandwidth issue, so I might need to just be voice for a while.
That's okay, as long as we can still hear you. I think it's fantastic in such an environment that's alien to us all, where we're presenting to an audience that we can't see, and that we have an Olympic champion who's put off his game. I think that's testimony to the questions coming from the audience, but also the interaction, because as I said right at the start, we wanted to keep it live. And one question I have for you, Iain, that we'll start and then we'll move forward is, in your slides, you talk about being 90% more energy efficient at high speed. I know you're looking at hydrogen further down the line, but if you look at those efficiencies with a hydrogen fuel cell, what could you extrapolate then as an efficiency ratio?
Well, our efficiency gains from that 90%, and it is quite size dependent, and it's obviously very dependent on what you're comparing it with. Some of those savings are coming from the efficiency of our drivetrain, of the MGU gearbox efficiency over a traditional combustion engine, and a lot of them are coming from the drag reduction of carbon fiber hydrofoil. So I think I would throw that back to the experts in terms of what are the efficiency losses from the hydrogen fuel cells down to an MGU in the water, because that's there'll be the additional losses at that point.
Here's an easier one for you in your own territory. Nigel asks, will the foils use azimuth technology for directional and control?
Yeah, well, what do you mean easier? I'll be looking that up. All our control modules are done using physics-based simulations. We analyze the data heavily, but I guess nature of our background in the America's Cup is that our vessels go out and race. They're not iterative in the sense. So we are always using physics-based models for our control autopilot, for our ride height autopilots, or our steering autopilots are all using physics-based models, using sensors and algorithms down from those sensors, very like an aircraft. Of course, we've looked at the concept of data-based AI improvements on that, and to do that, you need to obviously have a lot of experience to build that up. At the moment, anyone wants to come and have a play in the simulator, they'll get a real feel for some pretty heinous conditions where our control, we simulate the waves all down the full depth of the wave in some very, very confused and big seas with big side winds, and the controllers are able to handle those conditions very admirably and actually significantly removing a lot of the uncomfortable motion that us non-sailors feel when we're on the water. And it seems to be one of the biggest appeals is the lack of seasickness that it can provide.
Thank you.